Silas Boone stood in the doorway of the Whitfield barn with snow still melting off his shoulders, his hat in one hand and a decision already half made in his chest. Eleanor Whitfield stood across from him with a lantern raised between them, waiting for the rest of a sentence she could tell he did not want to finish. "I'll work through the winter," he said. "Fences, horses, whatever needs doing before the roads close, but I'll be gone by spring." Eleanor did not answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that the lantern flame seemed to hold its breath along with her. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than before, stripped of anything performative. "Then give me a winter worth remembering," she said. "That's all I'm asking for, and it's more honest than most men manage to offer." Neither of them moved for a moment, two strangers standing in a cold barn making an agreement that sounded practical and was not entirely practical at all. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall over Sweetwater Ridge, Dakota Territory, quiet and steady, as though the whole valley intended to hold them to their word. It was the last week of October in 1883, and Eleanor Whitfield had buried her father 4 months earlier after a horse threw him crossing the North Creek in high water. She had spent every week since learning exactly how much work one man's hands had been doing that she had never fully accounted for. Thomas Whitfield had built the horse ranch from 160 acres and a stubborn refusal to fail, and Eleanor had grown up beside him, learning every part of it, the breeding lines, the grazing rotations, the way weather moved differently through this particular stretch of the territory. What she had not learned, because there had never been reason to, was how to do all of it entirely alone through a Dakota winter. The ranch itself sat in a shallow bowl of land between two low ridges that broke the worst of the northern wind, a piece of ground Thomas had chosen specifically for that reason after 2 seasons of scouting the territory on foot before he ever filed a claim. Eleanor had grown up hearing that story so many times she could recite it herself, her father's voice, his particular way of making practical decisions, sound almost like fate. She was 29 years old that October, unmarried by circumstance more than choice, having spent her 20s tending a father who needed her more each year rather than courting the kind of attention that might have taken her elsewhere. She did not regret those years, though she sometimes wondered, in quiet moments, what her life might have looked like if the ranch had needed her less. Her mother had left when Eleanor was 14, unable to bear another isolated winter on land that asked more of a person than most people had to give, and had gone back east to a sister's house in Ohio, with promises to send for Eleanor that had arrived, over the years, less and less often. Eleanor had learned early that people who loved this land sometimes stayed, and people who did not could not be talked into staying no matter how much you wanted them to. Jedediah Voss, who had hired on with Thomas Whitfield 11 years earlier and had become, in Eleanor's mind, something closer to family than employee, had announced in September that his knees would not survive another Dakota winter, and that his daughter in Bismarck had a warm room waiting for him. Eleanor had wished him well and meant it, and had then spent 3 sleepless nights doing arithmetic on how many hands one ranch actually required to survive January. She had ridden into Sweetwater Ridge the following week and posted a notice at Odom's Mercantile, seasonal help wanted, room and board and modest wage, and had gotten exactly 1 reply worth considering. Silas Boone had walked into town 3 days later on a tired horse with a bedroll and a droving resume that checked out with 2 ranchers he named, a man clearly passing through rather than settling. Mrs. Odom, who ran the Mercantile and knew most of the territory's comings and goings better than the county recorder, had watched Eleanor read the letter of introduction Silas offered, and had leaned across the counter with the particular directness of a woman who considered gossip a public service. "Drifter," she said quietly, "but an honest one, from what I hear. Sometimes that's the better kind to hire, since they've got nothing to prove and nothing to hide behind." Eleanor had thought about that assessment more than once in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she turned over most useful advice, uncertain yet whether Mrs. Odom's confidence would prove accurate. She rode home from town that day with the letter folded in her coat pocket, already composing in her mind the practical terms she intended to offer. He told her plainly, before she had even finished explaining the work, that he was bound for the gold fields near Deadwood come spring, following word of steady wages guiding supply wagons through the Black Hills. Eleanor had appreciated the honesty more than she expected to, because honesty about leaving was a rarer gift than most people realized. She had hired him anyway. Some decisions did not require certainty, only enough practical sense to recognize a good offer when it stood in front of you holding its hat. The first weeks passed in the particular rhythm of two people learning each other's work habits without yet learning much about each other personally. Silas rose before dawn without being told to, checked the horses twice before breakfast, and worked through cold that would have sent a less determined man back to whatever town he'd come from. Eleanor found herself, more than once, watching him from the kitchen window as he moved through the corral, noting the particular economy of his movements, the way he never wasted emotion mending a fence or settling a nervous horse. She told herself this was simple professional interest, the way any rancher assesses a hired hand's competence, and mostly believed it. Conversation between them, in those early weeks, stayed close to the work itself, fence counts and feed rations and the state of the northern grazing land before frost took the last of the grass. Silas answered questions plainly when asked, and did not offer much beyond what was asked, a man clearly practiced at keeping himself to himself. It was the horses that first cracked something open between them, the way animals often do with people who are careful about everything else. Eleanor had a young mare, difficult and easily spooked, that her father had been working with before his death, and that nobody had properly handled since. Silas spent an hour with the mare his second week on the ranch, saying nothing to Eleanor about his intentions, simply standing at the fence rail, speaking low and even until the animal's ears stopped pinning back at his approach. Eleanor watched from the barn door, arms crossed against the cold, and felt something shift in her assessment of the quiet stranger sleeping in her father's old bunkhouse. "You've got a gift with her," Eleanor said, when he finally stepped back from the fence. "Wasn't a gift," Silas said. "Just patience and knowing when to stop pushing. Most things respond to that, animals and people both." Eleanor considered that longer than the comment probably warranted, turning it over the way she turned over most things she wasn't ready to say aloud. She wondered, walking back to the house, whether he had meant it as advice about the mare or about something else entirely. November brought harder frost and shorter days, and with them a routine that began, gradually, to include more than work. Eleanor started setting 2 plates at the kitchen table instead of leaving Silas to eat alone in the bunkhouse, telling herself it was simple practicality, less firewood spent heating 2 separate rooms. They talked, over those evening meals, about small things first, the weather patterns of the territory, the particular stubbornness of Dakota soil, the books Eleanor kept on a single shelf that Silas asked permission to borrow one evening in a voice that suggested he did not ask for things often. She noticed that he read carefully, the way he did everything, finishing one book fully before starting another. One evening he returned a worn novel with a question about its ending, and the two of them spent an hour arguing amiably about whether the story's hero had made the right choice staying behind for the woman he loved instead of pursuing the fortune he'd set out to find. Eleanor found herself more invested in that conversation than she expected, though she did not examine too closely why the question felt more personal than a simple discussion of fiction should. Silas admitted, toward the end of that argument, that he generally preferred stories where characters left rather than stayed, finding something more honest in a man who admitted his own restlessness than one who claimed contentment he might not fully feel. Eleanor filed that comment away without response, though it stayed with her longer than most things people said in passing conversation. She learned, in pieces over several weeks, that he had grown up on a Kansas farm his family lost to drought when he was 17, that his father had not handled the loss well, and that the family had scattered afterward in the particular way families do when the thing holding them together disappears. He did not say much more than that, and Eleanor did not push, understanding instinctively that some doors open slowly or not at all. He mentioned once, almost in passing, a younger sister who had gone to live with an aunt in St. Louis after the farm failed, a sister he had not seen in nearly a decade, despite writing to her twice a year without fail. Eleanor asked whether he intended to visit her someday, and Silas said only that a man who could not stay in one place long enough to earn a proper address was not much use to anyone waiting for him to arrive. December arrived with the first serious storm of the season, 3 days of wind and snow that tested every fence and every decision Eleanor had made about winter preparation. Silas worked through it without complaint, moving cattle and horses to the sheltered draw on the property's eastern edge, a piece of ground her father had always sworn by for exactly this kind of weather. On the second night of the storm, a section of the horse barn's roof began to strain audibly under accumulated snow, and Eleanor woke to the sound of Silas already outside, shoveling by lantern light before the weight could bring the whole structure down. She joined him without pausing to think twice about it, working alongside him in the dark and cold, until the roof's groaning eased into something closer to silence. They stood afterward in the barn's doorway, both soaked through and exhausted, watching the storm continue outside with the particular satisfaction of people who have just successfully defended something worth defending. "Your father built a good roof," Silas said. "Just needed someone willing to clear it before it proved that the hard way." Eleanor laughed, a short, surprised sound she had not expected to make in the middle of a blizzard, and Silas looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something warmer than the professional courtesy he usually kept close to the surface. Neither of them mentioned it directly, but something between them had shifted in the storm's aftermath, quiet and undeniable. Christmas came and went with a simplicity that suited them both. A small dinner Eleanor prepared and Silas ate with genuine gratitude, a modest gift exchange that consisted of a new pair of work gloves for him and a carved wooden hairpin he had made himself for her. She kept that hairpin in her hair more often than not after that, though she told herself it was simply practical, nothing more. Silas had spent 3 evenings on that hairpin, whittling it from a piece of ash wood by the bunkhouse stove, and had nearly thrown the first 2 attempts into the fire before deciding the third was finally good enough to give. He did not tell Eleanor any of that when he handed it to her, only that he'd noticed her pins kept slipping and thought he might as well try his hand at fixing the problem. Eleanor had turned the hairpin over in her fingers that evening after he'd gone back to the bunkhouse, tracing the careful grooves he had carved along its edge, and had understood, without either of them saying so directly, that it represented considerably more attention than a practical gift required. She did not mention that understanding to him, filing it away instead alongside all the other small evidences that their arrangement had become something neither of them had planned for. January brought the deepest cold of the winter, weeks where the thermometer nailed to the porch post rarely climbed above 0, and the two of them settled into evenings by the fire that stretched longer than strictly necessary. Silas told her more, in those long, dark hours, about the droving life he had lived since 17, cattle trails from Texas to Kansas to Montana, a life defined entirely by movement. "Why keep moving?" Eleanor asked him one evening, the fire low and the question more honest than she had planned to make it. Silas was quiet a long moment before answering, the particular quiet of a man deciding how much truth a question actually deserved. "Watched my father lose everything trying to hold on to one piece of ground," he said finally. "Watched what it did to him. Watched the family come apart around it. Made it easier, after that, to never plant anything I couldn't afford to walk away from." Eleanor understood that better than she wanted to admit, thinking of her own mother's departure and the particular ache of loving people who eventually left anyway. She did not tell him, that night, how closely his reasoning matched her own careful habit of guarding against exactly this kind of attachment. "My mother left when I was 14, she said instead, offering the truth in trade for his. "Couldn't bear the winters, or maybe couldn't bear my father's particular way of loving this land more than he sometimes remembered to love the people on it. I understand wanting to stay unattached to things that might disappear." Silas looked at her for a long moment across the firelight, something unguarded crossing his face before he caught it and pulled it back. "Then I suppose we made our agreement for good reason," he said. "Two people who understand exactly what they're not promising each other." But the winter did not care much for the careful boundaries they had drawn around themselves. February brought calving season early for 2 of the mares, difficult births that required both of them working through cold nights with lanterns and steady hands, and the shared labor built something between them that words had been too cautious to build on their own. The second mare's delivery went badly. The foal turned wrong. And for 2 hours, Eleanor and Silas worked together in the birthing stall with a focused intensity that left no room for anything except the animal in front of them. When the foal finally came, alive and struggling to its feet within the hour, Eleanor found herself crying in a way she had not allowed herself since her father's funeral. Silas did not try to stop her tears or explain them away, simply stayed beside her in the straw with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder until the crying eased on its own. "You did that," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, that foal's alive because you knew exactly what to do and didn't panic when it mattered most." Eleanor looked at him in the lantern light, aware suddenly of how close they were sitting, how natural his hand felt against her shoulder. She did not move away, and he did not either, and something unspoken passed between them that neither was quite ready to name. Spring, when it finally announced itself in the first thaw of March, arrived with a complicated weight neither of them had anticipated when the agreement was made in October. Eleanor found herself counting the weeks differently now, not toward relief but toward loss. A calendar that had once felt like simple practicality now felt like a countdown she had not meant to start. Silas grew quieter as the snow began to recede, and Eleanor recognized in his silence the particular weight of a man preparing to keep a promise he was no longer certain he wanted to keep. She did not ask him directly what he was thinking, holding to the same restraint that had governed their whole winter together, though the restraint cost her more now than it had in October. It was in the third week of March that Amos Garrity rode onto the Whitfield property, a trail boss Silas had worked under twice before, offering him a guiding position on a supply run into the Black Hills that paid better than anything Silas had been promised in Deadwood itself. Garrity sat his horse in the yard and made the offer plainly, a man used to recruiting drovers who understood exactly what good wages were worth. Garrity was a broad, weathered man who had run supply crews through the Black Hills for 6 years, and he made his case to Silas with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to good news being welcomed. "Pays better than anything you'll find guiding for the mining outfits direct," he said. "Season runs through October, and there's talk of a permanent foreman spot come next year if the work suits you." Eleanor, walking out from the henhouse with a basket of eggs, heard enough of the conversation to understand precisely what was being offered and precisely how good an offer it was. She stood frozen at the edge of the yard for a moment, the basket suddenly heavy in her hands, watching the exact shape of her winter's ending ride up on a tired gray gelding. Silas glanced toward her once during the conversation, brief and unreadable, before turning his attention back to Garrity's terms. Eleanor forced herself to continue toward the house rather than linger, though she heard little of what followed beyond the low murmur of two men discussing wages and departure dates. Silas told Garrity he would give him an answer within the week, and Garrity, satisfied with that, rode on toward the next ranch on his recruiting circuit. The silence he left behind in the yard was different from any silence Eleanor and Silas had shared before, heavier, and considerably harder to fill with ordinary conversation. That evening at the kitchen table, neither of them mentioned Garrity's offer directly, though it sat between them as plainly as the plates and the bread. Eleanor finally broke first, unable to bear the pretense any longer. "You should take it," she said. "Good wages, work you know, exactly what you came out here planning on. I never asked you to change your plans, and I'm not asking now." Silas set down his fork slowly, and something in his expression suggested her generosity had cost him more composure than her anger might have. "That's the trouble," he said. "I find myself wanting to change them anyway, and I don't rightly know what to do with wanting something I told myself, back in October, I wasn't going to let myself want." The fire in the hearth popped once, loud in the sudden quiet, and Eleanor found she could not quite meet his eyes for the length of a full breath. "Wanting isn't the same as deciding," she said carefully. "I learned that a long time ago, watching people want to stay and leave anyway. I won't hold it against you either way, whatever you decide." Eleanor did not answer right away, turning his words over the way she turned over everything important, cautious of hoping for something that might still slip away regardless of hope. "I told you back in October I only wanted a winter worth remembering," she said finally. "I never asked you to owe me anything past that, and I meant it then." "I know you meant it," Silas said. "That's part of why it's harder now than it should be. A man can walk away from an obligation easy enough. Walking away from something freely given is a different kind of leaving altogether." The days that followed carried a strange, suspended quality, both of them moving through the ordinary work of early spring, mending fences and preparing pastures, while the unanswered questions sat quietly at the edge of every conversation. Eleanor caught herself watching Silas more openly now, no longer pretending the watching was simple professional interest, though she still said nothing directly about what she hoped. She thought often, during those suspended days, of her mother's departure years before, the particular ache of a person choosing to leave despite every reason to stay. She wondered whether she was simply destined to watch the people she cared about ride away eventually, or whether this time might prove the pattern wrong. Silas, for his part, spent an unusual amount of time near the mare he had gentled that first week, standing at the fence rail in the evenings with an expression Eleanor could not quite read from the house. She did not ask him what he was thinking during those quiet vigils, respecting the same private space he had always respected in her. 4 days after Garrity's visit, a late storm swept down from the north with a violence the calendar suggested should have been impossible in April, dropping wet, heavy snow across the whole territory and threatening the newly born foals, still too young to withstand hard cold. Eleanor and Silas worked through that storm exactly as they had worked through every storm since October, together, without discussion, each simply moving to where the work required them. The storm itself had come on faster than either of them expected, wind driving wet snow sideways across the yard hard enough to sting exposed skin, and twice during the work Eleanor lost sight of Silas entirely in the white confusion between barn and pasture. Each time he reappeared out of the storm leading another frightened animal, she felt something in her chest ease that she did not have time to examine properly. They got the foals and mares into the barn's warmest stalls with hours to spare, packing straw and blankets with the practiced efficiency of 2 people who had learned each other's instincts over 5 months of shared crisis. When the last animal was settled, they stood together in the barn's lantern light, both exhausted, both aware that the storm outside was not the only thing that had reached its peak. "Garrity's leaving for the hills day after tomorrow," Silas said quietly. "Said he needs my answer by morning if I'm coming." Eleanor did not trust her voice enough to answer immediately, and the barn held the particular silence of a decision about to be made. "Then you should go make it," she said finally, though the words cost her considerably more than she let show. She walked back to the house alone that night, leaving Silas standing in the barn doorway with the storm still working itself out overhead, and did not sleep more than an hour before dawn. She told herself, lying awake in the dark, that she had known from October exactly what kind of winter she was asking for, and that wanting more now was simply the natural, foolish cost of having gotten one anyway. Morning came gray and quiet, the storm finally spent, the whole ranch coated in a wet spring snow, already beginning to melt under a pale sun. Eleanor dressed and went out to the barn early, needing the ordinary comfort of the horses more than she needed to face whatever answer the morning might bring. She found Silas already there, not packing, not saddling the tired gray gelding for a ride toward Garrity's camp, but mending the same fence section they had first spoken beside in October, working with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything that mattered to him. He looked up when she entered, and there was nothing uncertain left in his expression at all. "Thought you had an answer to give," Eleanor said carefully, not yet willing to trust what she was seeing. "Already gave it," Silas said. "Rode out at first light, told Garrity I wouldn't be joining the crew, and rode back before you were up to see it." "Why?" Eleanor asked, though some part of her had already begun to understand. "Because I spent all winter telling myself I only wanted a season I could walk away from clean," Silas said. "And somewhere around a mare foaling badly in February, I stopped being able to find the door." Eleanor crossed the barn floor without deciding to, and Silas met her halfway, and neither of them said anything else that needed saying in words. The fence post he had been mending stayed half-finished for a good while longer, though eventually, later that morning, it got done properly, the way most things on the Whitfield ranch eventually did. They did not marry that spring, nor did they rush toward any promise larger than the one already quietly settled between them. Silas took on the work full-time, not as hired help any longer, but as something the whole valley understood without needing it explained. And the ranch that had nearly broken Eleanor alone through one hard winter began, slowly, to thrive under two sets of capable hands. Jedediah Voss wrote from Bismarck that June asking after the ranch, and Eleanor wrote back a long letter describing the new foals, the repaired barn roof, and, almost as an afterthought, the man who had stayed. Jedediah's reply, when it came, was short and warm, and ended with a line Eleanor read twice before folding it away. Some men take a whole winter to learn where home actually is, and the good ones learn it before spring makes the choice for them. Eleanor kept the wooden hairpin Silas had carved her that first Christmas long after it had any practical use left in it, keeping it instead on the same shelf where her father's old ledgers sat. Evidence of two kinds of building that had both, in their own separate ways, made this land what it finally was. Silas never did make it to the Black Hills, though he told the story of Garrity's offer often enough at the Sweetwater Ridge Mercantile that it eventually became one of the valley's favorite pieces of settled history. Mrs. Odom, who had first called him an honest drifter back in October, took particular satisfaction in reminding anyone who would listen that she had suspected all along he was the staying kind underneath the traveling habit. Eleanor never corrected that version of events, though she privately suspected no one, including Silas himself, had known for certain until that wet spring morning with the fence half-mended behind him. The mare Silas had gentled that first week went on to become the foundation of a small breeding line the two of them built together over the following years, steady and reliable in exactly the way her early skittishness had once seemed to promise she never would be. Eleanor liked to say the mare had simply needed the right kind of patient attention to become what she was always capable of being, and she said it, more often than not, while looking at Silas rather than the horse. Sweetwater Ridge saw its share of drifters over the years, men who rode through following work and rumor and the promise of easier ground somewhere further west, and most of them kept riding the way drifters do. Silas Boone had very nearly been one more name in that long, forgettable list, remembered by no one, missed by no one, gone by the first thaw exactly as planned. Instead, he became something Sweetwater Ridge remembered differently. The drover who came for one winter and stayed for every one after, married eventually not to obligation but to a choice he made freely on a wet spring morning with a half-mended fence still waiting behind him. Eleanor Whitfield, for her part, stopped counting winters as things to be survived alone, and started counting them instead as seasons worth sharing with someone who had chosen, deliberately and without being asked twice, to stay. Amos Garrity, passing back through Sweetwater Ridge that autumn with a fresh crew bound for the hills, stopped at the Whitfield Ranch out of simple curiosity about the man who had turned down his best offer in 6 years of recruiting. He found Silas mending the same stretch of fence, a little further along now, and Eleanor bringing coffee out to the yard the way she had every morning since spring, and he did not ask again. Because sometimes the truest promises are not the ones people make when they arrive, full of easy confidence about how long they intend to remain. Sometimes they are the ones made quietly, months later, by a person who discovers they no longer want the freedom they once thought they needed, and chooses, instead, the harder and better work of staying. All characters and events in this story are original fiction. Take care of yourselves out there. Until next time, keep riding.